There's a particular type of person who moves through life almost invisibly. They don't demand attention. They don't dominate conversations. They don't broadcast their thoughts or achievements. To the casual observer, they might seem passive, unremarkable, perhaps even dull. But spend time with these people, engage them in genuine conversation, and something remarkable reveals itself. Behind the quiet exterior exists a vast interior landscape, a rich world of thought, reflection, and understanding that most people never suspect. These are the people who live quietly but think deeply, and they represent one of the most psychologically fascinating human types. So what drives this particular combination of external quietness and internal depth? What's happening psychologically that creates such disparity between outer behavior and inner life? And what can Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who spent his life exploring the hidden dimensions of human consciousness, teach us about why some people's richest existence happens in silence? To understand this, we need to start with Jung's revolutionary concept of introversion and what it actually means. When Jung introduced the terms introvert and extrovert, he wasn't describing shyness versus sociability. He was describing fundamental orientations of psychic energy. Extroverts direct their energy outward, toward people, objects, and external activity. They're energized by engagement with the outer world. But introverts direct their energy inward, toward thoughts, feelings, and internal experience. They're energized by engagement with their own consciousness. People who live quietly but think deeply are almost always introverts in Jung's technical sense. Their psychic energy flows naturally toward their inner world, and that's where their real life happens. The quietness isn't a lack or a limitation. It's a natural expression of where their energy is actually invested. They're not being quiet because they have nothing to say. They're being quiet because their energy is busy doing something else, building elaborate structures of thought, following chains of reasoning, making unexpected connections, exploring questions that have no easy answers. Jung would say these individuals are honoring their psychological type rather than fighting against it or apologizing for it. There's also something profound happening with what Jung called the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. Jung believed that consciousness, the part of your mind you're aware of, is just a small island in a vast ocean of unconscious content. Most people live primarily on the surface of consciousness, rarely diving into deeper waters. But people who live quietly but think deeply have developed unusual access to their unconscious. They're constantly in dialogue with deeper layers of their psyche, drawing up insights, images, and understanding from levels that most people never reach. This depth work requires quiet. The unconscious speaks in whispers, not shouts. It communicates through subtle feelings, symbolic images, and intuitions that are easily drowned out by external noise. People who live quietly have created, consciously or unconsciously, the acoustic conditions necessary to hear these quiet communications from their depths. Their external quietness is the container that allows internal depth to develop. When they're thinking deeply, they're not just processing conscious thoughts. They're accessing unconscious wisdom, drawing from sources that exceed their personal knowledge and experience. Jung would recognize these people as having developed what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to bring unconscious content into consciousness and integrate it. Let's also consider what Jung understood about psychological energy and its conservation. Jung believed that psychic energy is finite. You have only so much available, and you must choose how to spend it. Speaking, performing, managing social interactions, all of these activities consume enormous amounts of psychic energy. For people who live quietly but think deeply, the choice is clear. They're conserving their energy for the activity that matters most to them, thinking. Every word not spoken is energy saved. Every social interaction avoided is energy conserved. Every performance declined is energy available for internal work. This isn't antisocial behavior. It's strategic resource allocation based on clear understanding of what they value most. They've recognized that they can't do both external performance and deep internal work at the levels they want. Something has to give, and they've chosen to sacrifice external visibility for internal depth. Jung would see this as psychological wisdom, knowing yourself well enough to make choices that honor your actual priorities, rather than conforming to social expectations about how energy should be spent. There's also something crucial happening with what Jung called active imagination, a practice he developed for engaging with the unconscious. Active imagination involves focusing attention inward, allowing images and thoughts to arise spontaneously, and then engaging with them consciously rather than just passively observing. People who live quietly but think deeply are often practicing a form of active imagination without necessarily calling it that. They're constantly engaged in internal dialogues, exploring symbolic imagery, following trains of thought wherever they lead, questioning their own assumptions. This practice requires time, solitude, and freedom from interruption. It can't be done while multitasking or while managing social demands. Their quiet life creates the conditions necessary for this sophisticated internal practice. They're not wasting time in solitude. They're engaged in the serious psychological work that Jung considered essential for genuine self-knowledge and psychological development. Jung also spoke about what he called the attitude of consciousness and how it differs between people. Some people have what he called a concretistic attitude, focused on literal, practical, immediate reality. But others have what might be called a symbolic or philosophical attitude, constantly looking beyond surface appearances to deeper meanings and patterns. People who live quietly but think deeply almost always have this symbolic, philosophical attitude. They're not content with surface-level understanding. They want to know why, what does it mean, how does it connect to other things, what are the deeper patterns. This attitude naturally leads to quietness because philosophical thinking requires sustained attention that social interaction interrupts. They're quiet because they're busy doing something more interesting to them than talking. They're thinking about the nature of reality, the meaning of existence, the patterns that underlie appearances. Jung would recognize this attitude as characteristic of certain psychological types, particularly what he called introverted intuitive types, people whose primary function is perceiving patterns and possibilities in their inner world. There's also something profound about what Jung called the self and its relationship to quiet depth. Jung distinguished between the ego, your conscious sense of identity, and the self, the organizing center of your entire psyche that includes both conscious and unconscious. The ego is often loud, concerned with recognition and social position. But the self is quiet, concerned with wholeness, meaning, and authentic being. People who live quietly but think deeply have often made a crucial shift from ego-centeredness to self-centeredness. They're no longer primarily motivated by what the ego wants, recognition, approval, status. They're motivated by what the self seeks, wholeness, understanding, authentic expression of their unique nature. This shift naturally leads to quietness because the self doesn't need external validation the way the ego does. The self is content to work in darkness, to develop slowly, to remain unknown. People who live quietly but think deeply are often living from the self rather than the ego, and this explains why they're so comfortable with invisibility. They're not getting their sense of worth from external recognition. They're getting it from internal alignment, from the felt sense of living, according to their deepest nature. Jung would see this as the ultimate psychological maturity, transcending the ego's need for constant validation and living instead from the deeper center that doesn't require witnesses. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the relationship between thinking and feeling, and how this affects quiet depth. Jung identified thinking and feeling as two of the four primary psychological functions. Thinking types are primarily concerned with logic, analysis, and understanding. Feeling types are primarily concerned with values, relationships, and emotional connection. People who live quietly but think deeply are often thinking types for whom the thinking function has become highly developed. They've cultivated their capacity for analysis, synthesis, and understanding to extraordinary levels. But this development often comes at the cost of the feeling function, which Jung called the inferior function for thinking types. They may be less skilled at social niceties, emotional expression, or relationship management. This isn't a character flaw, it's psychological differentiation, the natural development of strengths in one area while other areas remain less developed. Their quietness often reflects this typological structure. They're not being quiet because they're socially anxious, though some might be. They're being quiet because their energy is invested in their dominant function. Thinking and social performance requires their inferior function, feeling, which doesn't come naturally to them. Jung would never suggest that they should force themselves to become more social or emotionally expressive. Instead, he'd encourage them to honor their natural type and to develop their thinking function to its fullest potential. There's also something significant about what Jung called the relationship with solitude and its role in psychological development. Jung himself spent significant periods in deliberate solitude, withdrawing from social obligations to focus on his inner work. He understood that certain kinds of psychological and spiritual development simply can't happen in company. They require being alone with yourself, facing yourself without distraction, exploring your depths without external interference. People who live quietly but think deeply have usually developed a sophisticated relationship with solitude. They're not lonely, they're alone, and there's a profound difference. Loneliness is painful absence of connection. Solitude is chosen presence with yourself. These individuals have discovered that solitude is where their best work happens, where their deepest insights emerge, where they feel most alive and most themselves. Their quiet life is often a life rich in solitude, and that solitude is the condition for their depth. Jung would recognize this as psychological health, the capacity to be genuinely alone without needing constant external stimulation or validation. Jung also understood something about what he called the numinous, experiences of the sacred or transcendent that exceed ordinary consciousness. People who live quietly but think deeply often have unusual access to numinous experiences. When you're constantly distracted by external stimulation, when your attention is scattered across endless interactions and obligations, you rarely encounter the numinous. But when you live quietly, when you've created space for deep attention, the numinous becomes more accessible. These people encounter it in their thinking, in moments when understanding suddenly deepens, when disparate ideas suddenly connect, when truth reveals itself in ways that feel like grace rather than effort. They encounter it in nature, in art, in moments of profound presence. And these numinous encounters nourish them in ways that social validation never could. Their quiet depth creates the conditions for genuine encounter with what Jung called the objective psyche, the reality of inner experience that exists independent of ego and that connects you to something larger than yourself. There's also something profound about what Jung called the shadow and how quiet depth relates to it. The shadow contains everything about ourselves we don't want to acknowledge. Jung believed that psychological health requires integrating the shadow, bringing it into consciousness and accepting it. But shadow work is difficult and often uncomfortable. It requires honesty, courage, and privacy. People who live quietly but think deeply often have more integrated relationships with their shadow precisely because they've done the private work of confronting it. They're not performing a perfect persona for the public because they're comfortable with their own complexity, their own darkness, their own contradictions. They've sat with their shadow in quiet contemplation, acknowledged it, and begun the lifelong work of integration. This shadow integration creates depth because you become more whole, more real, more authentically human when you stop splitting yourself into acceptable light and unacceptable darkness. Their quietness allows this integration to continue because they're not constantly performing a false light persona that denies the shadow. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the relationship between time and depth. Jung recognized that different psychological processes operate on different timescales. Some things happen quickly, reactions, opinions, social performances. But other things happen slowly, understanding, wisdom, integration. These slow processes can't be rushed. They unfold according to their own organic timing. People who live quietly but think deeply have aligned themselves with slow time. They're not interested in quick reactions or instant opinions. They're interested in deep understanding that takes time to develop. Their quietness creates space for slow ripening of thought, for ideas to mature, for connections to form gradually rather than being forced prematurely. Jung would appreciate this patience. This willingness to let understanding develop at its own pace, rather than forcing premature conclusions just to have something to say. There's also something significant about what Jung called compensation, and how quiet depth might be compensating for something else. Jung observed that the psyche naturally compensates for one-sided conscious attitudes. If you're too extroverted consciously, your unconscious will produce introverted dreams. If you're too focused in one area, your unconscious will draw attention to neglected areas. In a culture that's become extremely extroverted, noisy, superficial, and performance-oriented, people who live quietly but think deeply might be serving a compensatory function, not just personally, but collectively. They're balancing the culture's extreme extroversion with their introversion, its noise with their quiet, its superficiality with their depth. This compensation is valuable not just for them, but for everyone, demonstrating that another way of being is possible, that you don't have to live on the surface. Jung also understood something about what he called individuation and its relationship to quiet depth. Individuation, remember, is the process of becoming your authentic, unique self, rather than just conforming to collective patterns. But individuation requires differentiation from the collective, discovering what's uniquely yours versus what you've absorbed from others. This differentiation is nearly impossible when you're constantly immersed in collective noise, constantly responding to collective demands, constantly performing for collective approval. People who live quietly, but think deeply, have created the distance from the collective necessary for genuine individuation. Their quietness isn't isolation. It's the space needed to hear their own voice distinct from the collective chorus, to discover their own values separate from social norms, to develop their own understanding rather than just absorbing collective opinions. Their deep thinking is the actual work of individuation, questioning what they've been taught, examining their assumptions, discovering what's genuinely theirs. Jung would see these individuals as successfully individuating precisely because they've had the courage to live differently, to be quiet in a noisy world, to think deeply in a shallow culture. There's also something profound about what Jung called the relationship between opposites and the tension they create. Jung believed that psychological growth happens through holding the tension between opposites rather than collapsing them into one side. The opposition between quiet and loud, between depth and surface, between introversion and extroversion, these create productive tension. People who live quietly but think deeply are consciously holding one pole of these oppositions. They're not trying to be balanced by being moderately quiet and moderately deep. They're embracing the extreme of their natural orientation, living very quietly and thinking very deeply. This creates tension with the collective, which values the opposite pole, but that tension is productive. It generates energy, creates possibilities, and produces genuine individuation. Jung would encourage this embrace of your natural pole, rather than forcing yourself toward some false middle ground that doesn't honor your actual nature. Let's also consider what Jung understood about meaning and how it's discovered. Jung believed that genuine meaning isn't found in external success or social recognition. It's discovered through engagement with your own depths, through the difficult work of making the unconscious conscious, through living according to your unique nature rather than collective expectations. People who live quietly but think deeply are engaged in this search for meaning. Their quiet life isn't empty. It's full of meaning that comes from internal sources rather than external validation. They find meaning in understanding something deeply, in making unexpected connections, in having insights that change how they see reality, in moments of genuine encounter with their own depths. This meaning sustains them in ways that external success never could. Their depth thinking is essentially a spiritual practice, whether they frame it that way or not. They're seeking truth, understanding, connection with something larger than their individual ego. Jung would recognize this search as fundamentally human and would honor the quiet depth that makes it possible. There's also something crucial about what Jung called the conjunctio, the union of opposites that creates wholeness. For people who live quietly but think deeply, there's often a conjuncture happening between their quiet exterior and their deep interior. They're not split, with one part visible and another hidden. They're integrated, with both dimensions working together to create a whole person. Their exterior quietness protects their interior depth, and their interior depth gives substance and meaning to their exterior life. This integration creates wholeness in a way that constant performance prevents. When you're always projecting outward, you can lose touch with your depths. When you're always performing, you can forget who you are beneath the performance. But people who live quietly but think deeply maintain connection between all levels of their being. Jung would see this as psychological health, the kind of integration that makes genuine wholeness possible. Jung also spoke about what he called the wisdom of symptoms, the idea that psychological symptoms are often attempts at self-healing rather than just problems to be eliminated. In this sense, the quietness of people who think deeply might be a symptom with wisdom. Perhaps they were once too social, too scattered, too externally focused, and the quietness emerged as a correction, as the psyche's way of creating conditions for necessary depth. Or perhaps the deep thinking emerged first, and the quietness followed as a necessary protection of that thinking. Either way, the pattern has wisdom. It's serving psychological needs that might not be served if the person forced themselves to be more social or less contemplative. Jung would explore the wisdom of this pattern rather than immediately trying to change it. There's also something significant about what Jung called the relationship with death and how it affects how you live. Jung emphasized the importance of confronting mortality, of living with awareness that life is finite and precious. People who live quietly but think deeply often have this death awareness. They've recognized that life is short, and they want to spend it doing what feels genuinely meaningful to them, thinking deeply, understanding truly, living authentically. They're not interested in wasting their finite time on superficial social performances or trivial pursuits. Their quiet depth is their answer to mortality, their way of making their limited time count. Jung would see this as existential maturity, living with full awareness of death and letting that awareness shape your choices toward what truly matters. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the collective unconscious and how deep thinkers access it. Jung believed that beneath the personal unconscious lies the collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche shared by all humanity, containing universal patterns, archetypes, and inherited wisdom. Most people never consciously access this layer, but people who live quietly and think deeply often make contact with the collective unconscious through their contemplative practice. When they're thinking deeply, they're not just processing personal thoughts. They're tapping into patterns that transcend individual experience, encountering archetypal images and universal truths that humans have always encountered. This access gives their thinking a quality of depth and universality that purely personal thinking lacks. They might have insights that feel like remembering rather than discovering, recognizing truths that feel ancient and shared rather than new and individual. Jung spent his life exploring the collective unconscious, and he would recognize people who live quietly but think deeply as fellow explorers of these deeper dimensions of psyche. There's also something profound about what Jung called the relationship between consciousness and unconsciousness as a dynamic dialogue. For most people, consciousness dominates and the unconscious is ignored or suppressed. But for people who live quietly and think deeply, there's genuine dialogue happening. Their consciousness asks questions, and their unconscious responds with dreams, intuitions, and symbolic images. Their unconscious presents problems, and their consciousness works to understand them. This back and forth creates psychological richness and depth that one-sided consciousness can't achieve. Their quiet provides the space for this dialogue to continue uninterrupted, for consciousness and unconsciousness to engage in the ongoing conversation that Jung considered essential for psychological health and development. Jung also understood something about what he called psychological types and the dangers of type development being too one-sided. While he encouraged people to develop their natural dominant function, he also warned that complete neglect of other functions creates imbalance. People who live quietly but think deeply, while following their natural orientation, should remain aware of their less developed functions. Their thinking might be extraordinarily developed, but what about their feeling function? Their capacity for relationship, their engagement with sensory experience? Jung would encourage these individuals to honor their dominant orientation while also gradually developing other dimensions, not to become extroverted or socially performative, but to become more fully human. The goal isn't balance in the sense of being equally developed in all areas. It's wholeness, which means acknowledging and giving some attention to all aspects of yourself, even while your primary energy flows toward your natural strengths. There's also something significant about what Jung called the reality of the psyche, his insistence that psychological experience is as real as physical experience. People who live quietly but think deeply understand this intuitively. They know that their inner life is real, substantial, valuable in itself, not just as preparation for outer action. A profound thought is as real as a physical object. A deep insight is as valuable as a tangible achievement. An inner transformation is as significant as an outer accomplishment. This recognition allows them to invest fully in their inner life, without feeling that it's somehow less real or less important than outer life. Jung spent much of his career arguing for the reality of the psyche against scientific materialism that dismissed inner experience as epiphenomenal or unreal. He would celebrate people who live quietly but think deeply as living proof that inner reality is substantial, meaningful, and worthy of devoted attention. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the relationship between solitude and creativity. Jung recognized that genuine creativity emerges from the unconscious and requires specific conditions to develop, primarily solitude, patience, and freedom from external demands. People who live quietly but think deeply have created optimal conditions for creativity. Their quiet life is the protected space where creative insights can emerge, where unexpected connections can form, where genuinely original thinking becomes possible. They're not performing creativity for others. They're engaged in the actual creative process, which is often messy, uncertain, and completely internal. The creative work they do might never be shared, or it might be shared only after long gestation. But the creativity itself is real and valuable regardless of whether it's ever externalized. Jung would recognize this as authentic creativity rather than the performance of creativity that dominates public life. There's also something profound about what Jung called the religious function of the psyche, the innate human need for connection with something transcendent or meaningful. Jung didn't mean religion in the institutional sense, but in the deeper sense of connection with what matters ultimately. People who live quietly but think deeply are often engaged with this religious function. Their deep thinking is a form of spiritual practice, whether they frame it religiously or not. They're seeking truth, meaning understanding of existence itself. They're asking the ultimate questions that have concerned philosophers and mystics throughout history. This engagement with the religious function nourishes them spiritually in ways that conventional social life often doesn't. Jung believed that modern people suffer from spiritual starvation, and he would see people who live quietly but think deeply as having found genuine spiritual nourishment in contemplative practice. Jung also spoke about what he called the second half of life and its different priorities. Jung observed that in the first half of life, we're naturally oriented outward, toward achievement, building our place in the world, establishing ourselves socially and professionally. But in the second half of life, there's a natural turning inward, toward questions of meaning, legacy, and spiritual development. People who live quietly but think deeply have often made this second half of life turn, regardless of their chronological age. They're no longer interested in external achievement or social positioning. They're interested in understanding, wisdom, preparation for death, and living according to their deepest values. This orientation naturally leads to quiet depth. The questions they're asking can't be answered in social situations. They require sustained contemplation, honest self-examination, and willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Their quiet life is the appropriate response to second half of life questions. There's also something crucial about what Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggest deeper orders of meaning connecting inner and outer reality. Jung believed that when you're living authentically, aligned with your deeper self, synchronicities increase. People who live quietly but think deeply often experience rich synchronicity precisely because they're paying attention in ways that allow them to notice it. They're not so distracted by external noise that they miss the subtle correspondences between inner and outer. They're not so busy performing that they can't recognize meaningful patterns. Their quiet depth creates the attentiveness necessary to perceive synchronicity, and their experience of synchronicity confirms that they're living in alignment with something larger than ego. Jung would see their synchronistic experiences as evidence that their quiet depth is putting them in right relationship with deeper orders of reality. Let's also consider what Jung understood about psychological maturity and what it actually looks like. Popular culture often equates maturity with social success, emotional expressiveness, or extroverted confidence. But Jung had a different understanding. For him, maturity meant consciousness, self-knowledge, integration of shadow, alignment with your authentic nature, and connection with the self. By these standards, people who live quietly but think deeply are often extraordinarily mature. They've achieved remarkable self-knowledge through their contemplative practice. They've integrated shadow material that socially successful people often deny. They're aligned with their authentic nature rather than performing a false persona. And they've often made contact with the self, the deeper organizing center of their being. Their quietness isn't immaturity, it's the natural expression of genuine psychological maturity that no longer needs external validation or social recognition to feel complete. Finally, there's something to be said about what Jung called vocation or calling, the sense that each person has a unique purpose. Jung believed that discovering and living your vocation is central to individuation and essential for a meaningful life. People who live quietly but think deeply have often discovered their vocation, and it's precisely this: to think, to understand, to explore consciousness, to dive into depths that others don't access. This isn't a lesser calling than more visible, socially recognized vocations. It's equally valid and equally necessary. Every society needs people who think deeply, who ask fundamental questions, who explore the nature of reality and consciousness. These quiet thinkers are fulfilling their vocation, living according to their unique calling, even if that calling doesn't bring social recognition or external success. Jung would honor this vocation as he honored his own similar calling, recognizing that the work of consciousness, the exploration of psychological depths, is valuable work regardless of whether the world acknowledges it. In the end, people who live quietly but think deeply represent one of the most psychologically sophisticated human types. They're not failing at social life. They're succeeding at inner life. They're not avoiding the world. They're engaging reality at levels most people never reach. They're not empty or boring. They're full of inner richness that exceeds what can be displayed or performed. Carl Jung, who himself lived much of his life in quiet depth, would recognize these individuals as kindred spirits, fellow explorers of consciousness who've understood something essential, that the most profound human experiences happen internally, that genuine understanding requires solitude and silence, that depth is more valuable than display, and that a quiet life devoted to thinking deeply is not a life wasted, but a life richly lived, aligned with one of humanity's highest callings, the expansion of consciousness itself.